Richard loved so many of us. There was only one true love in his life. At this time, Nikki is going to share a few words to the love of Christ. Invite him.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. It means so much to me. And one day when they're old enough, it will mean the world to RJ and Rachel. Over the last 11 months since we got Richard's diagnosis, we have seen an incredible outpouring of love and prayers from so many of you. Your love and support has been tremendous and has gotten our family through this very difficult year. Since Richard's passing, I've received countless messages, paragraphs of stories about him and what he meant to so many people, and how they are grieving with us. From high school friends, his team members and colleagues at Hilton, bartenders, servers, from Rooftop and Hotel Menage, to his many friends and business colleagues and family. The same words and sentiment repeat themselves in these messages. He was my mentor. He was a brother to me. He was a boss that believed in me. He was an inspiration in business, a leader in hospitality. He gave me guidance. He saved my business. He was my support system, the most incredible human I've met, the most generous person. I really wrestled with what I could say to you today that would fully encapsulate the kind of man Richard was. What I can share with you is Richard, from my perspective as his wife. I met Richard exactly 10 years and 5 days ago from today. It was February 4th, 2014. I know this day because the day I met him, I wrote it down in a journal. And I was not a person that kept a journal. But I wrote about it that day and every day that we spent together for months afterwards. I did this because the first day I met him, I felt in my bones Richard had a gift. God gave him a gift. I couldn't put into words back then, and he himself, I'm convinced, never knew it. But after 10 years of having thousands of intimate conversations with him, meeting his friends, observing him in rooms with over hundreds of people, sitting next to him at dinners, and having the ultimate privilege of knowing him as a husband and father, I now better understand his gift. When we first met, I was 30 years old, a young attorney focused on being an attorney. Richard was 46 years old, a longtime bachelor who had spent the last couple decades working to establish himself as a hotelier. He was focused on finding the love of his life, and maybe, if it wasn't too late, having a family of his own. We were seemingly on different paths, different generations, different priorities. But after some coaxing from a mutual friend, we were set up on a blind date. We had dinner, then went to the hotel bar at his Hotel Menage, and we talked and laughed on those bar stools into the early morning. We talked about how we grew up. His parents immigrated from South Korea in the 70s, mine from the Philippines. Our parents both landed in Cerritos, California. We talked about what it was like growing up as first generation kids. We talked about what he called our non-negotiables in a partner. Our past trials, our future dreams. The topics may have seemed heavy for a first date, but it felt completely natural. We had this bond between us that was immediate and intense, a connection that was effortless, familiar, like I knew him for much longer than the minutes that we actually shared. And that started a whirlwind romance. There were 28 days in that February, and we saw each other 20 of those days. 1 month after we first met, I introduced him to my parents. The next week, he introduced me to his. 9 months after that, he asked me to marry him. 9 months after that, we got married. The next year, we had our son, RJ. Looking back, it was fast. We moved fast. But at the time, it felt like it wasn't fast enough. There was a sense of certainty, each other's lives. And with that, a sense of urgency to start our lives together. I learned much of Richard's life before me through his stories, and he was a masterful storyteller. Richard's journey in the hotel industry is incredible. It is the quintessential rags to riches, self-made man story. He had great success that he earned himself with a big heart, a lot of grit, attention to detail, as he always said, and compassion for others. As many of you know, Richard spent 17 years at Hilton and climbed the ranks from the bottom up. He started as a 19-year-old kid working in the mailroom at the Anaheim Hilton. At the time, he drove a white Jetta, souped up, of course, with a license plate that said Hamster, which was a nickname his friends had coined. We still have that license plate. Richard loved cars. He was a man of his word. He kept every promise he made to me except one. He could not keep a car for more than 2 years. And he'd break this promise in the exact same way every time. You know how he would always say, dude, or bro. It would be the same way with me, but interchange baby. I'd get a call, baby. You know I love you, right? You know I love you so much. And I just want to live my life. I've worked so hard. And I'd say, you bought a car, didn't you? And he said, you're gonna love it. I talked to Peter, you're gonna love it. From the mailroom kid, he climbed the ranks to become the youngest hotel manager at the Anaheim Hilton. He was 32 years old. He ran teams, ran budgets, walked the properties every morning, held stand-up meetings with department leads, and he loved every minute of it. He admitted there were people who thought he was too young, too cocky, but he ignored it and kept going. He was moving towards something bigger. Even years after he left Hilton, he stayed loyal to the brand. Whenever we went on a vacation, if there was a Hilton in the area, he booked it. After the Anaheim Hilton, he became the general manager of the Hilton Costa Mesa. He told me how he somehow finagled a lunch meeting with Anton Segerstrom. The Segerstrom family owned the South Coast Plaza, and they still do. Richard sat across from Mr. Segerstrom, who was always Mr. with Richard, and he made his pitch. Mr. Segerstrom, we should change the name of South Coast Plaza to the Hilton Plaza. At that point, as Richard told it, Segerstrom looked at him, gave a chuckle, and he said, you got a lot of balls, kid. Obviously, Richard didn't close the deal, but that was Richard, always going after it with no fear. He often said, you gotta throw everything you have at the wall and see what sticks. Some stick, some don't. You go with the ones that stick. In 2002, Richard made the pitch that changed his life. He learned that La Casa del Camino, a small historic hotel in Laguna Beach, was going on the market. He also learned that from a CPA friend that Japanese businessman, Mr. Shinomiya, was coming to California to consider U.S. investments. With a prepared business proposal in hand, Richard met with Mr. Shinomiya, and he walked him through La Casa and took him to the rooftop, which at that time was a structural roof to the hotel. And he made the pitch of his life. He pitched his expertise in the hospitality world, his work ethic, his trustworthiness, his vision for the property. And that very night, Mr. Shinomiya agreed to fund Richard's dream. The next day, the money was wired. Years later, Shinomiya said he wasn't investing in the hotel. He wasn't investing in the rooftop. He was investing in the kid that was making the pitch. Richard was 35 years old at the time. Shinomiya gave Richard the opportunity of a lifetime, and Richard returned on his promise to Shinomiya tenfold. Richard and Shinomiya stayed together in nearly every venture after that. Shinomiya ended up being one of Richard's groomsmen at our wedding. They loved each other like brothers. You know the saying, it's not personal, it's business? There's no such thing with Richard. He made everything personal. You couldn't help but be personal with Richard. His relationships with his team members at every one of his hotels and restaurants over the years was personal. I know this because I saw the after effects years later. Whenever we went on a family vacation, there would always be a welcome gift in our room with a personal note from a former team member of Richard's, who was now either a director of front office or a general manager at the property. Former sales team members would send him tickets when they found out he had kids. It was as if these former team members, his staff, was aching to return some massive favor to Richard, but it was really them reciprocating the grace that Richard had shown them years ago. For over 10 years, Richard put his heart into La Casa and created the Rooftop Lounge. He went to acquire other properties and ventures, but he always referred to La Casa as the OG, his baby. During the La Casa and Rooftop days, Richard worked hard to build his company and portfolio. He worked hard, played hard. He was single for a long time. He had incredible travels, he played a lot of golf, he enjoyed his souped-up cars, and he formed tremendous friendships. I mentioned earlier that I knew when I first met Richard that he was given a God-given gift that I couldn't put into words back then. Richard was a magnet. He had this magical, magnetic force that pulled people towards him. He just made you feel good when you were around him. There was such a genuineness about him, a natural ease and outgoingness that instantly made you relax and drew out the best in you, no matter the circumstances, no matter who you were, in whatever place or setting, lunch, dinner, a party, the line at CVS, a doctor's office. He was the source of laughter in every interaction. Boisterous, witty, so quick with humor. If you spent time with Richard, you were laughing. He innately cared about people. He cared about wanting to get to know you. And when he got to know you, his mind would be going in all sorts of directions on how he could help you, who he could introduce you to that could help you. And it could have been anything. Business, needing a career move, finding a family dog, finding a car to buy, anything. And he delivered on helping people because his pool of friendships and relationships was so vast. His token phrase was, "I have someone you should meet." 99% of us would make the introduction and leave it at that, not Richard. He would make the call, set up the lunch, then he would go to the lunch to make sure everyone felt comfortable in the meeting and make sure the meeting went well. And then he would pick up the tab. There was nothing strategic about him. There was no angle, no ask at the end. Great relationships came out of these Richard introductions, lifelong friendships, marriages, partnerships. His introductions were gifts. And people loved him because he was just Richard, authentic, unreserved, no pretenses, no airs, no inhibitions. He was unapologetically true to himself, and it was endearing. He recycled 3 outfits on a daily basis, no matter where he was going or who he was meeting. It was a black t-shirt, black shorts, a pair of Michael Jordans, and a black melon hat. If he felt a little crazy, he went with a camel melon hat. He loved black. I would ask him, "What's up with the black?" And he would just tilt his head and give me a big smile. "Come on, baby. Raiders." When RJ was born, he wanted to paint RJ's walls black with silver trim. He was a die-hard Raiders fan. There was no filter with Richard. He didn't try to talk fancy or appear better than anyone. Everyone was a bro or a dude to him. If there was a joke that popped in his head, he said it. If he thought something was funny, he said it, whether inappropriate or not. And he was quick with those jokes. His laugh was big and warm. It filled the room. If you heard it across the room, you gravitated toward it. I've seen it happen dozens and dozens of times. When he comes into a room and people hear his laugh, if they know him, they're making their way towards him. If they don't know him, they find themselves making their way to meet him. His voice was big and loud. He had a booming, low voice that carried, and he had one volume. There'd be so many times we'd be in a quiet setting listening to a speaker at a professional thing or a show or a movie theater, and he'd be saying something right next to me, and people would be turning around to look at him, the speaker would be looking at him, and I'd swat at him and say, "Can you lower your voice? Can you whisper?" And he'd just give me that smile and say, "Come on, baby, you know I don't have a library voice." Just as Richard was quick with jokes, he was just as quick to cry, and he owned it. He cried at movies, he cried whenever he opened a card from the kids, he cried at both childbirths, and whenever he gave a speech about me or RJ or Rachel in a toast or a birthday party, he most definitely cried. With a personality as big as Richard's and a presence as big as his in the community, it could have been very easy as a wife to feel small or to feel like I was the one supporting him. There was not 1 second of our entire time together that he let me feel that way. He knew I had goals for myself. He knew I had circles of friends and family that I cared about, and he made those his priorities and what he cared about. He made it clear, you chase your goals, you chase your dreams, I got the kids, I'll take care of things around the house. And he did. I was the one to go to work early and come home at the end of the day. If I had a trial that took me away, he was at home with the kids. If I needed him to come to a firm dinner or a bar function, he was there as a supportive husband. He checked in every day to see what kind of day I was having, and if it wasn't a great one, I'd come home and find fresh flowers on the kitchen counter and a glass of wine ready. He was a romantic. He would always put me first and make sure my tank was full. He always pushed me out the door to do things that took care of me. One of our early conversations was about having a family. Richard talked a lot about wanting a family. I asked him one time, why do you want a family? You have a fabulous life. He said, I've never had a family of my own, but I think I'd be a pretty good dad. He was an incredible dad. When RJ was born, something shifted in Richard. It was a different kind of devotion. Nothing ever took priority over me and RJ, and then when she was born, Rachel. Richard was the hands-on present parent. He was up at night when I was up. He changed more diapers than I ever did. He was the one with the kids in the morning when I went to work early. He did bath and books at bedtime. He scoured for things to do with the kids on the weekends. If either one of them showed any signs of being sick, he was the one that took them to the pediatrician. In fact, he took them to all their pediatrician appointments. He knew their weight, their height, their immunizations. He was the one that shopped for gifts for them. When RJ was old enough to go to school full-time, Richard was the one that took him to school every day. But he just didn't drop him off at Carline. He parked the car every day and walked RJ into class holding his hand. He loved taking RJ to his golf lessons. Richard watched every swing with pride, nostalgia, and anticipation for the journey ahead. He always said he couldn't wait until RJ was old enough to play a round of golf with him. When Rachel was born, Richard felt his life was fully complete. He wanted a family of his own for a long time, and he got it. She was his baby girl. She was the tiniest of us all, but he always said he was the most scared of her. He'd say, she's not scared of me. If I get mad, she gets more mad back at me. Rachel had the least amount of time with Richard, but they are so similar. RJ and Rachel are Richard. They look like him. They have his dimples. They have his laugh. They have his sense of humor. They have his spirit. They are his legacy. He was so proud of them. Richard lived a full life. He had incredible success in business. He built tremendous friendship and connections. He traveled the world. He had pureness of heart. He enriched so many people's lives in all kinds of different ways. He paid it forward and inspired people to pay it forward. And he got the sweetest ending. He got what he wanted most, the truest love and a family of his own that he adored. And we adored him right back. I'm not going to talk about cancer. That's not how I want to remember him. And it's not how he would have wanted us to remember him. I'll talk about his final days. When they told him there wasn't anything left that they could do for him, Richard knew he had weeks. In those last couple of weeks, Richard was committed to making sure me and the kids were prepared as much as possible for what was going to happen next, for the next phase without him. When Richard was fighting this disease, I was his mental coach. In moments when his body was failing him and the meds weren't working, I got down with him and I coached him through those days to keep fighting. But during his last couple of weeks, he became my coach, coaching me on staying strong for what I would be facing when he was gone. He became our kids' coach, repeatedly preparing them for what was to come, patiently explaining and re-explaining that he would be with them and watching over them even when they couldn't see him. I know this was incredibly hard on him because he did not want to leave us, but he cared more about making sure the three of us were prepared in every way possible. He passed in the most beautiful and peaceful way. He was sharp and lucid until his very last day. In his final days, I saw him settle deeper and deeper into his faith. He was anchoring to it. He had increased dreams and visions of divine presence, of God, of loved ones who passed. He had complete acceptance and reassurance of where he was going, and he was at peace. One of the messages I came across after Richard passed stuck with me. It was from one of his friends, Brian McDonald. He wrote this beautiful passage on what Richard meant to him, and he ended it with #LiveLikeRich. That struck me because anyone who knew Rich knows exactly what that means. We should all live like Rich.